Imagine waking up to videos of smoke spiraling over Russian military bases, hundreds of miles from the Ukrainian border. It sounds like the plot of a blockbuster, but it's real. On June 1st, 2025, Ukraine executed daring drone strikes deep inside Russia, reportedly leaving a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet in ruins. Within hours, jittery diplomats gathered in Istanbul for fresh peace talks. The world braced for a breakthrough, or a breakdown. But as the negotiators postured and posed, the global superpower you'd expect to steer the resolution, America, seemed oddly silent. Why has the U.S., once the axis of global diplomacy, suddenly stepped back? And what does this mean for the future of Europe, the West, and the very fabric of global order itself? Let's rewind. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia is now grinding into its fourth year. It's a war no one in Europe wanted, and no one around the world can afford to ignore. Since the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Russia has seized roughly 19% of Ukrainian territory. Ongoing battles, often bloody and costly, have reshaped cities and lives. Russian and Ukrainian forces continue to wrestle for every square mile, even as both armies are battered by shocking casualty figures. Credible sources now estimate Russian killed or injured at nearly 790,000. Ukrainian losses, while lower, have reached a staggering 400,000. But numbers don't capture the agony, nor the complexity. The human toll is eclipsed only by the geopolitical implications. Ukraine, teetering on the edge, has lost over a fifth of its GDP since war began. Russia's economy, against many predictions, has shown resilience, posting growth of 5.6% since 2022. Yet the cost of war is gnawing away at both nations' futures. Amid this chaos, one theme stands out: escalation. The June drone strikes are a case in point. Ukrainian operatives reportedly spent over a year covertly smuggling unmanned aircraft into Russian territory, hiding them in plain sight. On a Sunday morning, Kyiv launched a carefully timed attack targeting multiple airfields across Russia. The primary goal: to cripple Russia's ability to launch strategic bomber sorties, missions that have rained destruction on Ukrainian cities since the earliest days of the conflict. But the attack signaled something bigger. Ukraine showed the world, and perhaps its own people, that it could still hit Moscow where it hurts. Those who have been saying Putin is winning are wrong. The Ukrainians are holding their own, even though the support they've been receiving from the United States and other free nations has been woefully insufficient, says Clifford D. May, founder of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. The symbolism wasn't lost on the Kremlin either. As images of burning Russian runways spread online, Russian officials called for vengeance. But even as the fighting escalates, so do the attempts, however feeble, to resolve the crisis diplomatically. Just hours after the drone strikes, Russian and Ukrainian delegations converged for a second round of negotiations in Istanbul. The world's cameras were ready. Expectations weren't. The first such talks, held the previous month and shepherded by the Trump administration, delivered little but disappointment. This time, American involvement was even more muted. Secretary of State Marco Rubio phoned his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, at Lavrov's request. The message was simple. President Trump wants continued direct talks to achieve peace. Yet neither Trump nor Rubio attended the talks in person, and the American presence was practically invisible. So why the American silence? Insiders point to a shift in the Trump administration's stance. Frustrated by the lack of results, President Trump has reportedly grown disengaged, lashing out in private but taking little public action. His earlier threats to impose new, crushing sanctions on Russia remain just that, threats. This retreat, subtle but unmistakable, has alarmed both European allies and American lawmakers. Meanwhile, the Istanbul talks ended quickly and inconclusively. The only tangible outcome was a prisoner exchange, the classic all-for-all deal, swapping seriously wounded and ill prisoners of war. A humanitarian gesture, perhaps, but far from the breakthrough the world hoped for. Fundamental disagreements remain unbridgeable. Russia's negotiating list, American officials said, was a non-starter, packed with conditions Ukraine and the U.S. can't possibly accept. As the diplomats packed their bags, frustration simmered in Washington. President Trump wants a ceasefire. That's possible, but only if he makes good on his threats to put devastating pressure on Putin, Clifford D. May warned. Yet for now, Trump seems reluctant to up the ante. Some in Congress aren't waiting. Led by Senator Lindsey Graham, a bipartisan group is racing to push for tariffs, up to 500% on any country buying Russian energy. That's a move that would roil global markets and could trigger retaliation, but it underscores how the power balance is teetering. For ordinary Ukrainians, the mood is tense but defiant. President Volodymyr Zelensky insists that rewarding Putin would only show that war pays off, and that decisions for Europe should not be made by Putin. He refuses to consider territorial concessions, despite pressure from some corners of the West to cut a deal and end the bloodshed. Ukrainian public opinion is split. About 51% now support negotiations, compared to 61% of Russians who say they want peace talks. War weariness is growing, but so is suspicion. What might Ukraine be forced to give up to stop the bombs? And yet the situation is fragile for both countries. Despite Russia's territorial gains, a net 33 square miles in Ukraine just last week, Ukraine pulled off an unlikely coup, capturing 2 square miles in Russia's Belgorod region. Symbolically, the message is clear. Ukraine can still take the fight to Russia, even as it loses ground at home. For the U.S., the stakes are enormous and conflicted. On the one hand, public and bipartisan support for Ukraine remains high. On the other, calls for a ceasefire and a speedy resolution are growing louder, especially as America heads toward another contentious election cycle. Donald Trump has publicly argued, "We want Russia and Ukraine to agree to a deal and that we're fairly close." But is that optimism justified or just wishful thinking? Political scientist Ivan Krastev argues that Trump is mistaken to see the war as a mere land dispute with little bearing outside Eastern Europe. Where Trump is wrong is to see the war in Ukraine primarily as a land dispute of little significance beyond Europe, Krastev says. Others worry about the long-term consequences if America turns away. The cost of conflict goes far beyond the front lines. For Ukraine, the economic pain is acute. A GDP collapse of 22.6% since the war's onset, a battered infrastructure, and a society under constant stress. For Russia, sanctions, military spending, and diplomatic isolation bite even as oil and gas exports keep the economy afloat. Yet the economic fallout isn't constrained to the combatants. Europe, already reeling from energy price shocks, faces another looming crisis if new sanctions or tariffs are imposed. Global supply chains have rerouted, wheat and fertilizer exports are disrupted, and inflation is a constant specter. And what about NATO? If America steps further back, can Europe fill the gap? Wolfgang Ischinger, former German ambassador to the U.S., warns that Europe going it alone could be the end of NATO as we know it. The alliance, built on the idea of U.S.-European solidarity, has never faced a test like this. Michael Clark, a prominent security analyst, says candidly, "Peace talks will continue in a circle until the U.S. gets more heavily involved." So the world watches and waits. On one side, Russia, damaged but dug in. On the other, Ukraine, wounded but unbowed, searching for new ways to strike back and win global sympathy. Hovering in the background is America, the old superpower, now uncertain about its next move. The Trump administration's hesitancy injects volatility into an already combustible region. Behind the closed doors of the Situation Room and the Kremlin, decisions made, or not made, over the next few weeks could reshape the world for years to come. And that leaves us with some urgent questions. Is Ukraine's bold campaign, smuggling drones, striking Russian bombers, a sign of desperation or strategic genius? If the U.S. continues its hands-off approach, can Kyiv hold the line, or is it doomed to accept a deal on Moscow's terms? Could a miscalculation spark a wider, perhaps regional, war? And as Washington debates sanctions and Europe braces for more upheaval, just how close are we to a real resolution, or to something far more dangerous? The world stands on a knife's edge. Allies are watching. Markets are anxious. For millions, the price of a diplomatic misstep could be catastrophic. As we look ahead, one thing is clear. The next moves by Ukraine, Russia, and especially the United States may tip the balance between uneasy peace and catastrophic escalation. Now, as the dust settles after Ukraine's shock drone attack deep inside Russia, the war stands at a terrifying crossroads. The world watches, breath held, as a new chapter unfolds, one that could rewrite not only the fate of Ukraine, but also the very landscape of global security. What happens next hinges on choices made not just in Kyiv and Moscow, but in Washington, Brussels, and every capital that has a stake in Europe's fragile peace. Let's peer into the future. What are the likely scenarios on the table, and what might they mean for Ukraine, Russia, and the world at large? First, imagine a grinding stalemate, the protracted war scenario. Neither Kyiv nor Moscow can deliver the knockout blow both crave. Russian gains near Sumy and Pokrovsk are met by Ukrainian raids, all while battered cities, exhausted soldiers, and anxious families watch the front lines inch forward or back. In this future, the war becomes a war of attrition, bleeding Ukraine economically and militarily. The economy, already shrunk by nearly a quarter, takes another hit. International attention shifts. As news cycles move on, donations slow, and the world tires of headlines about far-off battlefields, Ukraine's ability to wage a high-tech defense falters. Russia, though battered by sanctions and losses, nearly 800,000 killed or wounded, if credible estimates are believed, digs in. If neither side bends, both risk breaking. In Scenario 2, under mounting pressure and dwindling resources, negotiations are forced, perhaps with a nudge from Washington or Berlin. Ukrainian and Russian delegations, battle-weary and politically battered, sign a deal. The price? Bitter territorial concessions. Crimea, parts of the Donbass, gone, at least for a generation. In exchange, Ukraine gets shaky promises, non-aggression, aid, maybe even a frozen conflict that lets the world look away. But this so-called peace comes with a hidden cost. Inside Ukraine, fury and grief simmer. Would ceding land end the fighting, or only set the stage for future wars? Political chaos is likely. As Volodymyr Zelensky has warned, any reward would only show Putin that war pays off. Europe, uneasy and divided, is left wondering if appeasement really buys security, or just emboldens the next aggressor. And then there's Scenario 3, the nightmare scenario, miscalculation. A missile lands the wrong side of a border, or a drone strike takes out a target that triggers furious escalation. Suddenly, NATO finds itself pulled in. Air defenses light up over Poland or the Baltics. Sanctions whiplash through global markets. Energy prices spike. Cyber attacks cripple infrastructure far from the front. In this future, the war in Ukraine becomes a conflict that engulfs Europe and threatens to spiral far beyond. Michael Clark, a top security analyst, summed it up best. Peace talks will continue in a circle until the U.S. gets more heavily involved. Without clear, coordinated leadership from America and its allies, each step on the chessboard brings new dangers. But what about opportunities? Is there hope among the chaos? Analysts highlight that Ukraine's bold drone strike was not just desperation. It was, in many ways, a sign of strategic ingenuity. Using covertly smuggled drones, Kyiv delivered a psychological blow to Russia's military machine. According to Ihor Romanenko, former deputy head of Ukraine's military staff, the attack helped the West because it targeted Russia's nuclear potential. It reminds Moscow and the world that the Kremlin's war machine isn't invulnerable. Some experts see Ukraine's ability to innovate under fire as a testament to a broader lesson. Asymmetric warfare, creativity, and technology can sometimes level the odds, even in a David versus Goliath contest. But they also warn, a few audacious attacks cannot reverse the larger trends. For the United States and its allies, deep questions remain. Will America's current retreat doom Ukraine to a grim, unfavorable peace? Or will the vacuum of U.S. leadership tempt Russia to push even further, risking a wider war? The answer seems to hinge on a single uncomfortable reality. When America steps back, other powers move forward. As Wolfgang Ischinger, the respected German diplomat, warns, Europe going it alone in Ukraine could be the end of NATO as we know it. This moment is a stark reminder that geopolitical influence, like nature, abhors a vacuum. American disengagement doesn't mean calm, it means uncertainty. As the Trump administration grows quieter and more hands-off, the fragile negotiations risk collapse. Russia's demands remain non-starters for Kyiv, and yet diplomatic fatigue sets in. Without robust mediation, every ceasefire talk is another spin of the roulette wheel. So what does all of this mean for you, watching at home? First, it's a powerful lesson in the ripple effects of global power. Wars are not fought in a vacuum. Decisions, whether made in Washington, Moscow, or Brussels, shape real lives, real economies, real futures. With Russia controlling nearly a fifth of Ukraine's territory and both sides exhausted, the choices of policymakers will decide whether peace, stalemate, or disaster loom next. Second, this is a study in strategic resilience. Ukraine's economy has withstood a staggering 22.6% contraction, a number that would cripple most nations, yet the spirit to resist endures. Even as U.S. aid recedes, Ukrainians improvise, adapt, and strike back in surprising ways. This tenacity, powered by both necessity and the fear of losing everything, is a case study for anyone facing overwhelming odds. Third, the events in Ukraine spotlight the dangers of short-term thinking in foreign policy. The world's attention span is short, but conflicts don't resolve themselves just because the cameras move on. If international support ebbs, the risks of escalation grow. What seems like a far-off problem can rapidly become a fire at your doorstep, be it through energy prices, cyber disruptions, or refugee flows. The lesson? Global stability is everyone's business, and ignoring distant wars does not make you safer. And finally, perhaps the most personal takeaway, this crisis is a real-time lesson in the power and peril of technological innovation. The drones crossing Russian airspace weren't just military hardware. They were a signal that innovation, grit, and surprise can sometimes deliver David-sized blows to Goliath. But these same technologies, if misused or left unregulated, can easily set the world spiraling toward catastrophe. So what comes next? The answer is, alarmingly, still unwritten. Will America's reluctance to engage usher in a bitter peace, one forged on Ukrainian concessions and European unease, or will it open the door to a sudden, catastrophic escalation? Was Ukraine's drone blitz a masterstroke of timing, sowing chaos and showing defiance, or an act of desperation against mounting odds? The experts are split. General Richard Danett predicts that there will probably be a ceasefire of some sort in the next 1 to 3 months, but warns that the underlying issues will remain unresolved. Even Krastev, meanwhile, cautions that to see this war as a simple border dispute is to miss the stakes, confusing the chessboard for the game itself. This isn't just about land, it's about the future shape of Europe, the integrity of alliances, and deterrence in a perilous new world. But here's the secret fact, hidden in plain sight. Every generation has believed that distant conflicts could be contained, that limited wars would stay limited. Yet history teaches otherwise. From Sarajevo to the Baltics, the flashpoints that ignite wider wars are rarely obvious at the outset, and are often a product of inattention, miscalculation, or misguided optimism. The choices made in the next few weeks will ripple for decades. If the US and Europe don't step up diplomatically, if Ukraine is left to fight alone, the outcome may be decided not by strategy or courage, but by exhaustion and fate. But if global powers seize the moment to broker a durable peace, one that recognizes Ukraine's sovereignty and Russia's need for security guarantees, then perhaps disaster can still be averted. So, what can you do? Stay informed. Don't tune out, even as headlines fade. Support organizations that bring aid and awareness to Ukraine and other conflict zones. Vote for leaders with a clear-eyed understanding of global security, not those who promise cheap isolation. Share stories that remind your community that peace requires vigilance, and that freedom, once lost, is rarely regained without cost. History is being written now, not just by generals and presidents, but by all of us, with the choices we make and the attention we pay. Let's not look back wishing we'd spoken up, paid attention, or demanded more from our leaders. The stakes are too high, and the lessons of Ukraine too urgent for silence. If you found this analysis illuminating, subscribe to our channel for more in-depth global reporting and insights. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you believe the next move should be? And stay with us as we continue to track the world's most urgent flashpoints.